The night they blamed me for a patient's death, the hospital went quiet in the worst way possible. Not silent. Careful. That kind of careful silence only happens when people know the truth, but decide the truth is too expensive to say out loud. My name is Claire Whitmore. I was 32 years old, a charge nurse at St. Catherine's Medical Center, and for 11 years I believed that if I worked hard enough, documented carefully enough, and stayed useful enough, the system would protect me. Then Evelyn Ross died. She was 68. Retired teacher. Tough, funny, impatient, and the kind of patient who still said thank you even when she was terrified. At 7:14 p.m., her blood pressure dropped hard. At 7:19, I paged the attending physician. At 7:23, I paged again. At 7:28, I escalated because the antibiotic order that should have been processed earlier was still stuck in the system. At 7:41, Evelyn coded. At 8:06, she was dead. At 8:17, hospital director Martin Hale walked into the ICU conference room, set down a thin folder, and decided I would be the one buried with her. He wore a charcoal suit, a calm expression, and the kind of sympathy powerful men perform when legal counsel is in the room. "Claire," he said softly, "there appear to have been documentation inconsistencies." I stared at him. I called twice. I escalated the delay. I charted everything. He gave me a measured little nod. The preliminary review suggests otherwise. Around the table, risk management wouldn't look at me. That was the moment I understood this had nothing to do with medicine. This was about narrative. And Martin Hale had already chosen his villain. Martin had spent 3 years rebuilding St. Catherine's into a polished machine. New donor wing. Magazine interviews. Innovation in patient care banners on every clean glass wall. He loved talking about efficiency, excellence, transformation. What he really loved was appearances. Earlier that week, administration had forced through a rushed software migration in the hospital's charting and medication acknowledgement system. IT warned them it wasn't ready. Nurses complained it was lagging. Medication approvals were getting delayed. Some alerts weren't routing correctly. Martin approved the rollout anyway. The hospital had an inspection cycle coming up, and delaying the system launch would make leadership look disorganized. So when Evelyn died after a delayed treatment order, Martin didn't see a woman. He saw risk. If the truth came out, the death wouldn't look like a single nurse's error. It would look like executive negligence. And executive negligence doesn't stay buried if the board smells it. So by midnight, I was suspended. By morning, I was already becoming a story other people told in lowered voices. Residents avoided eye contact. A clerk I'd trained pretended not to see me. One of the nurses from another floor gave me a look that was part pity, part fear. Fear was worse. Fear meant everyone understood what was happening, and no one wanted to be standing next to me when the system finished chewing. When I finally got home, I sat in my car with the engine off and my hands still gripping the steering wheel. My phone lit up. "Elena." I answered, and before I said a word, she said, "Do not sit there and let them write this for you." Elena Park was an ICU nurse, my closest friend in the hospital, and one of the only people I had ever met who treated executive authority like an annoying weather pattern. That was enough to break me. I cried so hard I couldn't answer. She waited. Then she said, low and steady, "They are counting on you to panic." I forced myself to breathe. "They're going to destroy me." "No," she said. "They're going to try." And that one word changed everything. Because there was one thing Martin Hale didn't know. I kept records. Not because I was paranoid. Because I had been a nurse too long. I'd seen chart notes quietly amended after bad outcomes. I'd seen incident summaries cleaned up for administration. I'd seen ugly facts rewritten in clean language so they could survive board meetings. So after every major critical event, I kept my own timeline notes until the formal review was complete. Nothing reckless. Nothing that crossed a line. Just enough to protect myself if the record ever started shifting. And on the day Evelyn died, I had more than notes. I had screenshots. Medication queue delays. System alert timestamps. Page logs. Escalation records. I had them because the moment that order froze, I knew something was wrong. At 1:12 a.m., Elena showed up at my apartment with takeout, coffee, and a flash drive. "What's that?" I asked. "Insurance," she said. Inside were staffing logs from my shift, copied before they could be cleaned up. The ICU had been short 2 nurses that night because agency coverage had been frozen to save costs. Another executive decision. Another corner cut. I looked at her. "You know they'll fire you if they trace that back." She dropped into a chair and shrugged. "Then let's make sure they trace it back after he's already bleeding." That got the first laugh out of me since Evelyn died. A bad laugh. Tired. Mean. But real. We spent the night building a timeline. Every page. Every delay. Every system fault. Every administrative choice that turned a dangerous night into a fatal one. By sunrise, grief had changed shape. It wasn't softer. It was colder. The next day, Hospital Legal emailed me a notice. Formal review hearing, Friday, 10 a.m. Attached was the incident summary they intended to use. My escalation calls were missing. The software delay was described as minor intermittent lag. And the antibiotic delay had been reframed as a nursing follow-through failure. I read it once. Then again. Then I leaned back and understood exactly what Martin was doing. He wasn't investigating a death. He was editing it. The first thing I needed was proof that Martin knew the software rollout was dangerous before Evelyn died. The second thing I needed was proof he was already trying to contain the fallout. The third thing I needed was patience. Because revenge built on anger collapses fast. Revenge built on sequence survives. That afternoon, I called Daniel Ross, Evelyn's son. I didn't call him to weaponize his grief. I called him because he deserved truth. "I'm sorry," I said. "I did everything I could. And I don't believe what happened to your mother was just a simple mistake." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, voice rough with exhaustion, "I knew it." I closed my eyes. "How?" "She told me one of the nurses looked angry, not careless. She said you were trying to get someone to listen." That nearly broke me all over again. Even in the middle of her own fear, Evelyn had understood more than the people running the building. I asked if administration had contacted him. "Yes," he said. "Some director." Smooth voice. He kept saying they were reviewing a breakdown in nursing procedure. Of course he did. I told Daniel to request every official record through counsel. He said he already had a lawyer. Good. That evening, Elena texted me, "Check your email." An anonymous forward was sitting in my inbox. 2 attachments. The first was a calendar invite titled, Software Launch Risk Containment. The second was a PDF of meeting notes. At the bottom was Martin Hale's name. I opened the notes. Bullet point 3 read, "Proceed with Go Live before inspection. Delay acknowledgement issues can be managed at unit level. Avoid written escalation beyond directors." I stared at the screen. He knew. He knew the system could delay urgent acknowledgements, and he pushed it live anyway. Worse, he wanted complaints contained off record. I called Elena. "You got it?" she asked. "I got it." Guess who typed those notes? Who? His assistant. How do you know? My cousin plays tennis with her. I laughed again. This time it sounded less like grief and more like momentum. Now I had something real. Not enough to destroy him publicly, but enough to make him panic privately. Martin expected me to arrive at Friday's hearing frightened, isolated, and ready to negotiate the terms of my own collapse. Instead, I turned Thursday into architecture. 3 folders. Folder 1, screenshots, page logs, timestamps, treatment queue delays. Folder 2. Staffing records, IT warnings, rollout notices. Folder 3. Martin's meeting notes, calendar invite, and routing metadata. I printed hard copies. Backed up everything to 2 encrypted drives. Then I set scheduled release emails. If the hospital tried to terminate me after the hearing, every file would automatically go to the board chair, the nursing oversight office, and Daniel Ross's attorney. Not because I was dramatic. Because Martin had already shown me the kind of man he was. Friday morning, I walked into St. Catherine's in a fitted navy blazer, my posture straight, my expression calm, my striking reddish-orange asymmetrical bob perfectly in place. The darker auburn strands caught the lobby light. People turned to look. That part mattered. The accused are supposed to look shaken. I wanted them to see something else. Control. The conference room was exactly how I remembered it. Long polished table. White blinds. Air too cold. Martin at the far end beside HR and legal, looking like he was about to moderate a donor luncheon instead of bury a nurse. The chief medical officer, Dr. Leonard Graves, was there too. Hands folded. Face tight. Already worried. Martin gave me a sad, professional smile. Claire. Thank you for coming. Saturday, I wouldn't miss it. He began with administrative language polished smooth enough to hide blood. We are here to review the circumstances surrounding Mrs. Ross's unfortunate outcome. Unfortunate outcome. Not death. Not preventable failure. Outcome. He spoke for 6 full minutes without saying Evelyn's name. Then he slid the summary toward me. This reflects our current understanding of the timeline. I glanced at it and set it down. No, I said. It reflects your preferred version. The room went still. Martin's smile tightened. If you have corrections, this would be the appropriate time. I opened folder 1. Oh, I said softly. I do. For the next 10 minutes, I walked them through the truth. 1 page at a time. My first page. My second page. The treatment delay. The frozen acknowledgement queue. The escalation call. The missing response. The minute Evelyn's condition started crashing. HR looked confused. One attorney started writing much faster. Martin interrupted only once. These materials were not part of the official chart. I held his gaze. That's because the official chart stopped telling the truth. That landed. Then I opened folder 2. Staffing freeze authorization. Denied agency request. ICU short 2 nurses on a high acuity shift. Then the IT memo. Explicit warning that urgent acknowledgement delays could occur during peak load after launch. Dr. Graves leaned forward. I never saw that. I slid the page toward him. Your office was copied. He looked down and the color left his face. That was the first crack. Martin tried to recover. Technical advisories are routine precautionary notices. Interesting, I said. Then why were staff told not to put complaints in writing during the rollout? No one answered. So I answered for them. Because written complaints become discoverable. One of the risk attorneys stopped taking notes and looked at Martin directly. He was no longer watching a disciplinary hearing. He was watching liability take shape. Martin folded his hands carefully. Claire, I understand emotions are high. There it was. Make the woman sound emotional just before the evidence ruins you. So I placed folder 3 in the center of the table. His eyes dropped to it immediately. And for the first time since Evelyn died, Martin Hale looked afraid. I didn't open it right away. I let the silence stretch until it started costing him. Then I asked, would you like to explain what software launch risk containment means? Nobody moved. I opened the folder and handed copies to everyone except Martin. He already knew what they said. HR read first. Then legal. Then Dr. Graves grabbed his copy so hard he nearly bent it. There it was in black and white. Proceed before inspection. Manage delay issues at unit level. Avoid written escalation beyond directors. Martin's voice came out tighter than before. These notes are unauthenticated. I expected that. So I slid the calendar invite beside them. Then the metadata printout. Then the routing path from his assistant's email. No, I said. They're inconvenient. Legal asked for a recess. HR stepped out. Dr. Graves removed his glasses and pressed his fingers to his eyes like a man revisiting every bad compromise that had brought him here. Martin stayed seated. When the room emptied, it was just the two of us at opposite ends of a polished table covered in his choices. Finally he looked at me and asked quietly, "What exactly do you want?" Not "is this true?" Not "how do we fix this?" Not "what happened to Mrs. Ross?" What do you want? Because men like Martin don't think in moral terms. Only in transactions. So I gave him my answer. I want Evelyn Ross's record corrected. He swallowed. I want my suspension removed in writing. His jaw tightened. And I want the board to receive every page in this room before the end of the day. That was the line that actually hit him. Then I leaned in slightly. And Martin? This isn't blackmail. It's mercy. Because if I were doing this the way you would, the press would already have it. He lost color. You're making a mistake, he whispered. I smiled without warmth. No. I'm correcting one. When the meeting resumed, the tone had changed completely. No one spoke to me like I was under review anymore. They spoke to me like I was holding a controlled demolition charge. By 2:30 that afternoon, my suspension was temporarily lifted pending expanded review. By 4:10, the board had received a full document package. By 5 o'clock, Martin cancelled a donor gala appearance. At 6:13, Elena texted me, "The rats are learning to swim." I should have felt victorious. Instead, I felt tired. Because revenge in real life isn't dramatic. It's paperwork with a heartbeat. On Monday, the hospital announced an external review. Publicly, it was framed as a routine patient safety assessment. Internally, everyone was panicking. People who had ignored me now remembered my name. Department heads asked if I was holding up. Compliance officers smiled at me like we'd always been allies. Institutions do that. They don't reward courage. They reward whichever version of courage becomes safest after the fact. Daniel Ross's attorney requested an interview. I agreed, with counsel present. That part mattered. Revenge is useless if you don't survive it. At the interview, I told the story once. Cleanly. Chronologically. No extra drama. Good evidence does not need performance. When I finished, the attorney asked, "Why didn't you go public immediately?" I thought about it. Because I wanted the truth to last longer than a headline. She nodded slowly. Meanwhile, Martin disappeared. No calls. No hallway sightings. No statements. But men like him don't go silent because they surrender. They go silent because they are calculating. And I knew what his next move would be. If he couldn't dump this on me anymore, he'd dump it on someone else. He just needed a new body between himself and the board. Thursday night, Dr. Leonard Graves called me directly. "I'd like to meet," he said. I almost laughed. To apologize? A pause. To tell the truth. We met at a diner off the interstate. Burnt coffee. Red vinyl booths. Rain ticking against the windows. Graves looked 10 years older than he had in the conference room. He slid a folder across the table. Martin overrode the phased rollout, he said. IT wanted more testing. I objected to the timing. He said putting concerns in writing would damage institutional cohesion. I looked at him. Did you put them in writing anyway? He didn't answer. That told me everything. Cowards are always late to their own conscience. Inside the folder were printed text messages. One line stood out immediately. If nursing takes the procedural hit, the board won't dig into launch governance. I read it once. Then again. Graves watched me with the exhausted face of a man who finally understood that silence had not protected him, only delayed his humiliation. I should have stopped him, he said. Yes, I said. You should have. I took the folder. That was all the absolution he was going to get from me. By the next morning, the board was in emergency session. Donors were asking questions. Outside counsel had been brought in. External reviewers were demanding unrestricted access to communications tied to the rollout. Unrestricted. Beautiful word. That night, Martin called me from a private number. I answered on the third ring. Claire. His voice still had polish, but now it sounded thin around the edges. You shouldn't be calling me, I said. Let's not make this worse than it needs to be. I turned toward the city lights outside my apartment window. Worse for who? For everyone. The hospital. The staff. Patient trust. No. I cut in. Patient trust collapsed when your ego started signing safety decisions. He exhaled sharply. What do you want? Reinstatement? Money? A settlement? There it was again. He truly believed every person had a price because his always did. I want you, I said, to say Evelyn Ross's name. Silence. Then he said, this is not productive. Neither was what he did. But I didn't say that. I said something colder. You let a woman die to protect your quarter. He snapped then. You have no idea what it takes to run a hospital. I looked at my reflection in the glass. No, I said. But I know what it takes to save a patient. And you got in the way of both. He hung up. That was the moment I stopped being afraid of him. The next morning, before the board had even finished its meeting, I sent the full record package to state regulators and the Nursing Oversight Office. Because Martin losing his job wasn't enough. The system needed a scar. By noon, the rumor had spread through St. Catherine's. Martin Hale had stepped aside. That's executive language for being pushed overboard before the smell reaches the investors. At 1:15, the board chair sent an internal memo about leadership transition and a commitment to transparency. Institutions always rediscover transparency after someone else drags them into daylight. At 2:40, Daniel Ross called me. They asked if we'd consider mediation, he said. And my mother didn't raise me to make easy men comfortable. I smiled despite myself. She sounds formidable. She was, he said softly. She would have liked you. That one stayed with me. I spent the rest of the day answering questions, forwarding files, clarifying timelines, and watching expensive people suddenly become extremely interested in the exact minute everyone first knew there was a problem. By evening, Dr. Graves had resigned too. Not because he was brave. Because his silence had become visible. When I got home, there was a certified envelope taped to my door. Inside was a formal letter from St. Catherine's. My suspension was rescinded. My standing restored. The preliminary findings used against me had been incomplete. Incomplete. Not false. Not manipulated. Incomplete. Even in retreat, they still sounded cowardly. At the bottom was an offer, back pay, leave, counseling, and a meeting to discuss future leadership opportunities. I laughed out loud in my empty apartment. Yesterday I was disposable. Today I was promotable. That's how institutions apologize when they still don't know how to repent. Elena came over with cheap champagne, read the letter, and snorted. Future leadership opportunities, she said. Translation: please don't burn the building down on your way out. I took the bottle from her. Tempting. A week later, I stood at Evelyn Ross's grave with white lilies in my hands and a silence I had finally stopped trying to outrun. Daniel was there. So was his wife. No cameras. No hospital representatives. No polished condolences. Just weather, stone, and what had been taken. He looked at me and said, "My attorney told me what you did." I set the flowers down carefully. I wish it had saved her. He nodded. I know. We stood there for a while. Then he asked, "Why did you keep fighting after they blamed you?" There were a dozen answers I could have given. Because I was angry. Because Martin was a coward. Because truth matters. But the real one was simpler. Because she trusted me, I said. Daniel looked at the headstone and swallowed hard. She did. That was the only blessing in the whole story. When I left the cemetery, I expected triumph. What I felt instead was release. Because revenge stories in movies end with confessions and handcuffs and falling music. Real justice is quieter. It lives in corrected records. Resignations. Closed doors. Reputations that don't recover. Still satisfying though. Because Martin didn't just lose his office. He lost control of the story. And for a man like him, that was worse. Over the next month, investigations widened. Staffing policies were reviewed. The rollout became a case study in what happens when executives choose optics over safety. Board members retired early. Directors quietly vanished into consulting work. And then I did the last thing anyone at St. Catherine's expected. I resigned. They offered leadership tracks, committee positions, public support. I said no. Because I had learned too much about polished institutions to mistake temporary shame for transformation. Instead, I joined a patient safety advocacy group and helped build a network focused on whistleblower protections in healthcare systems. Small at first. Then bigger. It turns out that once you stop being afraid of powerful people, they become excellent case studies. Elena stayed another year just to watch administration squirm. She claimed it was community service. I believed her. As for Martin, 3 months after his resignation, he reappeared exactly where men like him always do. On a stage. A private healthcare leadership summit in Chicago had him listed on a panel called Resilient Organizational Governance. Elena sent me the event flyer with 6 laughing emojis and the message, cockroach with a lanyard. New headshot. New bio. Same carefully managed face. To most people, it probably looked like he had escaped. To me, it looked like opportunity. I didn't go to Chicago. I didn't need to. Instead, I sent a clean evidence packet to the Summit Ethics Committee, the sponsoring association, and the journalist moderating the panel. No threats. No melodrama. Just documents, dates, findings, and 1 sentence. You may wish to review whether Mr. Hale's inclusion aligns with your standards for patient safety leadership. By noon the next day, his panel listing was gone. By evening, a sponsor issued a statement about updated programming. Updated programming. Elena called laughing so hard I had to hold the phone away from my ear. You got him kicked off a panel without leaving your couch. No, I said. I filed a correction. But privately? That one felt good. Because Martin's real weakness was never prison. It was exclusion. He had built his entire identity on being welcomed upward. So I made sure the doors stayed shut. Every time he resurfaced with a new title, I sent truth ahead of him. Quietly. Legally. Precisely. Not obsession. Maintenance. 6 months later, I spoke at a patient safety forum in Washington. Small room. Serious people. No vanity lighting. My kind of audience. Afterward, a woman in a tailored suit approached me. I'm on the board of a regional health network, she said. We've been reviewing executive accountability structures after reading about St. Catherine's. Reading about it. Good. She handed me a card. Would you consider advising us? On what? On how to make sure nurses can't be used as shock absorbers for executive mistakes. For a second, I couldn't answer. Because in that moment I realized the revenge had already grown larger than the wound that started it. It wasn't just about Martin anymore. It was about making the next Martin harder to build. So I took the card. Yes, I said. I would. That night, alone in my hotel room, I stood in front of the mirror and looked at the woman staring back at me. Same vivid green eyes. Same sharp cheekbones. Same reddish-orange asymmetrical bob that made people remember my face. But the woman looking back at me was not the one who had sat in her car outside St. Catherine's, terrified her life was about to be erased. That woman had been hurt. This one was dangerous. Not because I had become cruel. Because I had become clear. And clarity is what institutions fear most. Anger can be managed. Grief can be contained. But a clear woman with records? That is structural damage. My phone buzzed. Elena had sent me a screenshot of Martin's LinkedIn. He now described himself as a strategic advisor in healthcare transformation. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. Then she texted, "Should we transform that too?" I texted back, "Already drafting." The last time I heard Martin Hale's voice live was almost a year after Evelyn Ross died. He left me a voicemail first. No greeting. No introduction. Just low, controlled anger. "You've made your point." I listened to it twice. Then I called him back. He answered immediately. "What do you want from me?" he demanded. I sat at my desk, morning light cutting across paper stacks and policy drafts. "I wanted you to stop being able to hurt people from positions of trust," I said. He gave a short, bitter laugh. "You think you changed anything?" "Yes." Silence. Then I continued. "You thought nurses were disposable. You thought patients were branding risks. You thought paperwork was a weapon only people like you could use." His breathing sharpened. "I learned from the best," I said. Then I hung up. I never heard from him again. A month later, regulators issued final findings tied to the St. Catherine's rollout. Unsafe implementation practices. Inadequate escalation protections. Leadership interference in incident integrity procedures. There it was. Bureaucratic language, yes. But permanent. The kind that follows a man longer than gossip does. Daniel emailed me that night. Mom would have called that a proper ending. I read it 3 times before replying. She deserved better than an ending. But I'm glad the truth caught up. And maybe that's why revenge stories like this one stay with people. Not because of cruelty. Because of correction. Someone bends the world through greed, vanity, or cowardice. And one ordinary person refuses to leave it bent. So when people ask me now if I regret any of it, the files, the hearings, the pressure, the way I quietly sealed every polished escape route Martin tried to crawl through, I tell them no. I regret Evelyn died. I regret how many people saw danger and chose comfort over courage. I regret how easy it is for institutions to call cowardice professionalism when the person suffering has less power. But I do not regret making truth expensive for the man who tried to profit from lies. Because revenge is not always destruction. Sometimes it is proportion. He tried to take my career, my reputation, my license, and hand a grieving family a false story so he could keep his title. So, I took the title, the reputation, the speaking invitations, the future rooms. And I replaced his version with the one he earned. That is proportion. That is patience sharpened into consequence. And that is why, whenever a young nurse asks me for one piece of advice now, I always give the same answer. Document everything. Not because every system is corrupt. Because when a system becomes corrupt, it usually does it in approved language, revised timelines, and polished email chains. You fight that with records. You fight that with sequence. And when someone important mistakes your silence for weakness, you let them. Until the file opens. If you've never watched a liar realize the evidence has outrun him, let me tell you what it looks like. It isn't loud at first. No thunder. No shouting. Just tiny things. A blink that lasts too long. A hand flattening papers that don't need flattening. A voice becoming careful because confidence has suddenly become unaffordable. That's what Martin looked like when folder 3 hit the table. And honestly, that moment stayed with me longer than the resignation. Longer than the findings. Longer than the cancelled panel and the closed doors. Because that was the exact second the story changed hands. Until then, Martin believed he was the narrator. After that, he was just another name in my evidence file. That matters. Especially for women in professions built on sacrifice. Predators love roles that train you to absorb damage quietly. Nurses solve, soothe, stabilize, carry. Men like Martin assume that means we will swallow injustice the same way we swallow exhaustion. Most of the time, they're right. This time, he was wrong. This time, the nurse kept the receipts. And in the end, those receipts did what loyalty and hard work alone never could. They made power answer questions. So yes. The hospital director blamed me for a patient's death to save his career. Unfortunately for him, I kept the treatment charts. And when he tried to bury me under administrative language, executive posture, and polished lies, I did the one thing he never prepared for. I stayed calm. I got organized. And I made sure the truth arrived everywhere before he could stop it. Not loudly. Not recklessly. Permanently. That's the part people misunderstand about revenge when they imagine fury. The best revenge is readable. It has timestamps, backups, corroboration. It survives denial because it was built for denial. And when guilty people realize the story can no longer be edited in their favor, that's when revenge becomes resolution. Not just for the person they targeted. For everyone who watched the lie happen and thought no one could stop it. So if you're listening to this because someone powerful assumes your silence is guaranteed, because they wear a title, because the room bends toward them, because they think procedure belongs only to the people at the top, let them think that. For now. Take notes. Keep records. Wait until the truth is complete enough to stand on its own. Then open the file. And let the room change. I still remember the conference room. The cold air. The polished table. The way Martin said unfortunate outcome because he was too practiced to say death. I remember how small they expected me to feel. How manageable. How easy. And I remember the exact second they realized I wasn't there to beg. I was there to document a burial. Just not mine. Because arrogant people always think revenge looks like rage. So they prepare for noise. They do not prepare for a woman who arrives with folders, backups, and enough patience to let them lie first. That's why stories like this work. Because by a certain age, people understand something younger audiences are still learning. The world is full of loud villains. But the ones who truly lose, they usually lose in silence. In audits. In hearings. In the tiny click of a copied email opening in the wrong inbox. That click? That might be one of the sweetest sounds on earth. Evelyn Ross should still be alive. No revenge changes that. No justice repairs it. And I won't pretend otherwise. But justice does something important. It interrupts repetition. It warns the next ambitious coward that nurses are not disposable, patients are not public relations variables, and grief is not a gap to be managed with talking points. That matters. It mattered to Daniel. It mattered to the nurses who later told me they had started keeping better records because of what happened. And it mattered to me, because for one terrible night, I nearly let them define me inside their version of events. Almost. Then I remembered something simple. I knew what happened. And the truth, when preserved properly, is heavier than prestige. Heavier than titles. Heavier than every smooth sentence spoken by a man who thinks the system exists to cushion his fall. Maybe it usually does. But not this time. So here's the final lesson. If someone powerful ever tries to hand you the blame for damage they caused, do not waste your first strength trying to convince them to grow a conscience. Consciences are unreliable. Records are better. Gather proof. Protect sequence. Speak when the truth can stand on its own feet. Don't rush unless rushing protects someone. Don't shout unless shouting serves the evidence. Don't move from panic. Move from clarity. From patience. From precision. That's how you defeat people who thought you were too ordinary to fight back. That's how you turn survival into consequence. That's how a hospital director lost everything because he mistook a nurse's professionalism for weakness. He blamed me for a patient's death to save his career. Unfortunately for him, I kept copies. Did you enjoy this story? Then like and comment. Thank you.